Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. 6 weeks after the start of the Israel-Hamas war on the 7th of October, it's estimated that perhaps 36, some put it at 39, journalists have been killed and several score more have been injured. And that raises the question, exactly how daunting is the challenge journalists face in Gaza? It's an aspect of this crisis that hasn't got the attention it deserves, and that's what we seek to rectify today. Joining me live from London is the UK Director of Reporters for Frontières, Fiona O'Brien. Fiona O'Brien, let me start with a few simple general questions so we can establish the key facts before we proceed to actually discuss them. Do we have any sense of the total number of journalists in Gaza? I know of Rushdie Abu Alouf of the BBC and Hani Mahmoud of Al Jazeera, but beyond the two of them, what's your sense of the total number in the Gaza Strip as a whole?
Hello, Karan. Thank you very much for having me on, and hello to your viewers as well. It's a really good question, and actually the answer is that we don't really know how many journalists there are in Gaza. At RSF, we don't monitor, we're not a syndicate or a union, so we don't have members as such and don't monitor the number of journalists in any given region. So we don't have, there are various numbers flowing around, but we don't actually have a clear view on how many journalists there are in Gaza, but there are many. And what we do know, as you said in your introduction, is that many journalists have been killed. So our current numbers, our most up-to-date numbers, are that 37 journalists at least have been killed within Gaza. Added to that, another 4 in Israel during the horrific Hamas attacks on the 7th of October, and another in Lebanon. So a total of at least 42 journalists, and other reports of deaths that we're also still trying to verify. So that gives you, just a sense kind of the scale of how badly journalists have been affected in this conflict as well.
Let me ask you a slightly different question about Gaza City itself. Rushdie Abu Alouf of the BBC recently referred to a certain Khadir who was present at the Al-Shifa hospital when Israeli soldiers walked in and started checking patients room by room, floor by floor. How many other journalists are actually in Gaza City at this moment now that it's under Israeli occupation?
Yeah, so I saw the same reports on the BBC of a journalist called Khadir who was reporting from inside the hospital, as you say, and at some stage early yesterday, I think it was, communication with him was cut off. So we haven't heard from him in a while. We don't know exactly how many journalists there are in northern Gaza. Many have moved south in the hope of finding, relative safety, although safety is a word we can't really use in the whole of the Gaza Strip. So many have moved out of the north, but we know that there are still several journalists there. And they need to be protected and kept safe so they can continue reporting on what's happening there. We need our witnesses, and which brings us actually to the crux of the problem, isn't it? The reason that we're talking about journalists today is that we need journalists right across Gaza. We need access so that we know, everyone in the whole world knows what is happening there. Journalists have an extremely important role to play in conflicts, which is to bear witness, to record the things that are happening so that everybody knows.
I'll come in a moment's time to just how easy or how impossibly difficult it's become for journalists to do their job in the Gaza Strip as a whole, and presumably in Gaza City in particular. But first, a question about the death toll. Reporters from Frontières figure is 37 dead, and I believe scores, but we don't know how many injured. Are there also instances where journalists have been perhaps allegedly directly targeted by Israeli Defense Force bombing or aerial strikes?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And of course, to some extent, those are questions that need proper investigation, which will become clearer in the fullness of time. The total death toll in the conflict since the 7th of October is at least 42, but you're absolutely right, 37 inside Gaza. What we can say in terms of targeting, so one instance which took place in Lebanon, actually, a Reuters journalist called Issam Abdallah on the 13th of October, with 6 colleagues from various other international news organizations, was reporting close to the Israeli border. And their team, despite being in the open for over an hour, despite having very clear press markings on their vehicles, on their protective gear, were targeted by Israeli forces. What we can't say is that they were targeted because they were journalists, but we can say that they were clearly marked as journalists. Our initial investigations showed that the place where they were standing was hit by 2 strikes in very quick succession from the direction of the Israeli border, and there were Israeli aircraft overhead, helicopters, etc. So we know that they were targeted. Were they targeted as journalists? It's difficult to say at this stage. What we do also know is that within Gaza, at least 50, probably slightly higher than that now, offices of journalists, so the offices of Al Jazeera, AFP, all sorts of journalistic platforms, have been hit. Now, were they targeted because they're journalistic offices? All we can really say is that their positions are known. It's known that those outfits have offices in certain buildings, and those buildings have been hit. So it certainly looks to us at RSF like there is a very concerted effort to try and suffocate reporting in Gaza, to stop reporting from happening in a variety of ways.
Let me ask you a specific question about those journalists who were targeted near the Israeli border on the Lebanon side. Even if we can't say for certain that it was deliberate targeting, does it look increasingly like irresponsible carelessness?
What we can say is that journalists under international law are civilians in times of war and need to be able to, like civilians, they should be afforded protection. They should be able to continue their jobs without fear, and that is not happening. Journalists are being killed at a greater rate than in any conflict this century. And when you think that this century includes conflicts like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, that's a really shocking statistic. No conflict has been so deadly for journalists in all of that time. We're extremely concerned about the overall picture in Gaza, the deaths, also increasing numbers of confrontation between journalists and IDF members of the Israeli citizens, police forces right across Israel, the West Bank, through the region. Tensions are really ratcheting up, some very dangerous political rhetoric, which we can explore further if you're interested. And, so generally the whole situation is very dangerous for journalists. And again, just to call for the fact that they need to be protected. This has to stop. We can't continue in a situation where we wake up day after day with further reports of killings, targetings.
Now, against this background, let me ask you, how easy is it for journalists, whether they're in the north of Gaza or whether they're south of Wadi Gaza, how easy is it for them to operate? I know that the ones who work for major television networks are able to broadcast and do so fairly regularly, but what about those who work for other outfits?
For all journalists, including the international outlets, it's just challenging beyond words, really, for a number of reasons. So first of all, you have the intensive bombardment, so the level of physical danger is intense. But you have a situation in Gaza where the journalists that are reporting on the conflict are unable to leave the Strip. They are part of the society which is under attack. So in addition to the challenges of, finding safe ways to report, they're exposed to all of the same things that the rest of the Gazan civilian population is. They are struggling to find water. They are struggling to find food. They're struggling to find electricity. I mean, imagine for a journalist, if you can't charge your devices, for example, how on earth are you going to be able to report? They are most have had to move out of their homes. Some have moved several times from one house to another supposedly safe place, and then had to move on because of bombardments. Their families are all there, often in a different location to them. They're trying to keep in touch with them. The lack of communications makes it incredibly difficult to be in touch with family. And then you have the whole psychological aspect. Imagine losing so many colleagues. Gaza's a relatively small place. Journalists know each other. It's a community. Imagine losing so many colleagues in such a short space of time and then trying to continue with your job. journalists in Gaza, I can't overstate this, are utterly exhausted. They tell us that they cannot sleep for fear. Now and then when they're completely shattered, they'll grab a couple of hours sleep here and there. But they're utterly exhausted, psychologically spent, very, very scared, and have all these logistical problems on top of that. So it's an extraordinarily difficult situation for journalists. I think really unprecedented.
Now, for the last 2, maybe it's 3 days, Gaza City itself and perhaps large swathes of North Gaza have been under Israeli occupation. Do we have any sense of how Israeli soldiers in the north of Gaza are treating journalists?
So in Gaza itself, up until now, there haven't been many direct confrontations between Gaza between journalists, and soldiers. But as you say, that is likely to be changing as the situation moves on and as there is an increased Israeli presence on the ground. Where we have seen increased tensions between soldiers and journalists is right through Israel and also in the West Bank. Journalists there have been a number of confrontations. So we've had, for example, a team of BBC journalists who were detained when reporting in Tel Aviv. Apparently their vehicle was considered suspicious, even though, again, there were clear press markings on it, and they themselves were clearly marked as press and had the right identification. They were assaulted by Israeli soldiers. We've had confrontations in various places.
Physically assaulted?
One of them was struck in the neck, I believe, yes. And we've had an increasing number. I think we've documented at least 15 so far, but as you'll understand, in a moving situation, the numbers fluctuate, will change, will rise. A number of situations where there have been confrontations, detentions, arrests, right through. It tends to be Palestinian or Arab journalists who are most targeted, but this also applies to international reporters, and it also applies to Israeli journalists who are seen as being critical of the conflict. So, for example, journalists reporting for Haaretz newspaper, which it tends to take a more liberal stance than some other publications within Israel, have also been subject to similar attacks. And that's talking about the army. There's then another dimension to the tensions that we see, again, across the country, across the Palestinian territories, as well as Israel, is confrontations with civilians. So I suppose enabled by the general environment, civilians are finding themselves targeting journalists. There was a group of international journalists from a variety of international publications and broadcasters who were reporting in the south of Israel, close to the border, who were confronted by an Israeli citizen who actually broke the arm of one of the journalists in the course of that assault. And that citizen, really shockingly, although they were briefly detained, has since been left to go free. So you have this real ratcheting up of tensions on all levels, stoked by political rhetoric, stoked by the reality of what's going on the ground, stoked by, of course, extremely strong emotions on all sides, making for just a very, very difficult operating environment for all journalists.
Now, Fiona O'Brien, war reportage, wherever it happens, is never easy. But this time in Gaza, the journalists doing the reporting could end up becoming very easily unintended targets themselves, and maybe in 1 or 2 instances, even intended targets. There is literally no safe area for them at all. So how different is war reportage and war coverage this time around in Gaza compared to, say, the Ukraine over the last 18 months?
You're absolutely right, Karan. There is no safe location. I think for me, the biggest difference between this conflict and other ones which we've seen both in the region and beyond is that the reporters covering the conflict within Gaza are part of the society which they're reporting on. So as we've already discussed a little, they have all of those problems that all Gazan civilians are facing: the lack of water, the lack of sanitation, the fear for families, the loss of relatives, all those things. There's also a massive question around access. So usually in conflict zones, including Ukraine, and any other zone really through the world, international journalists are able to come in. People are able to go out. So you may report for a certain amount of time and then come out to a place of safety. In Gaza, that's not been possible. We've seen some international reporters enter the Gaza Strip in recent days, embedded with the Israeli army. So they've been able to have some level of access. But of course, when you move with an army, it's a fairly common tactic in war reporting to be linked to a particular army unit, but of course that comes with certain restrictions in terms of what you can see and what you're allowed to report, so it doesn't give us a full picture either. So there's a very, that sort of limitation of movement is really rare. When we speak to journalists in Gaza, very experienced journalists who've covered round after round after round of conflict within the region, they tell us that they have never seen anything the likes of which we're witnessing today. So I think, again, I can't really overstate how unusual and how serious the situation is there. You mentioned Ukraine, just to give your viewers a sort of sense in terms of numbers. The Ukraine conflict has been very dangerous for journalists. 7 journalists were killed there in the first month after the Russian invasion. So, and I think the current toll that we've lost about 11 journalists have been killed overall in Ukraine, which is obviously a horrible death toll, but pales in comparison to the numbers that we're seeing in Gaza.
I casually asked the question in my introduction, how daunting is the challenge journalists face in Gaza? After hearing what you've said, it's almost embarrassing to have asked that question in that casual way, because some of the facts are absolutely horrifying. There is one particular journalist, I believe his name is Muhammad Abu Hasir of the Wafa news agency, who has reportedly lost 42, some people say 44 members of his family. There is the Al Jazeera chief of bureau in Gaza, who was actually on air when he heard that his wife, his son and daughter had been killed, and they were in a refugee camp, the Nusayrat refugee camp, and even there they weren't safe. And then there's Rushdie Abu Aluf, who's been forced to flee to the south, and now he and his family are living in tents. These are conditions that journalists elsewhere in the world wouldn't even begin to understand.
Yeah, it's absolutely devastating. Mohammed Abu Hasira, who you referenced, was himself killed in the same strike that killed his family members. You talked about Wael Dahdouh, the Al Jazeera correspondent. He lost, like you said, his wife, his son, his daughter, and his grandson, and has continued remarkably with incredible fortitude and courage to continue working and reporting after that. I think the level of devastation and the psychological toll on top of all the safety concerns and the practical difficulties is just unspeakable, really, in terms of what journalists are going through. We spoke a few days ago to a freelance journalist in Gaza, Hani El-Sha'ir, who was describing to us, what it's like to experience the things they're experiencing. And he spoke about the indelible stain on his soul from witnessing the things that he's witnessing, from having to continue, and just on a really human level, the level of exhaustion after covering a conflict of this intensity for so long, to be able to continue picking up your camera, your notebook, going out there, trying to find contacts, trying to the best of your ability to understand what's going on, is really remarkable. And I have enormous respect for the journalists who, despite the odds, are trying to continue telling the world what is happening in Gaza. And again, it's extremely important that they do that, because we need to know.
Absolutely. Now, I know that the journalists in Gaza are doing an incredible job, and I don't mean to cast any aspersions on them, but the question that arises to my mind, and I imagine many in the audience will feel the same, is, do we have a full sense and an accurate sense of the picture and situation in Gaza? Because these journalists can only report what they have access to and what they see. Are we therefore getting, and I'm not blaming them at all, but are we, the audience, getting the full broad picture?
No, I think it's a very valid question. And of course, the answer is we're not getting a full picture. They're doing an incredible job and telling us, as doing the job to the absolute the best of their ability, and very well. But in any conflict, access is always the biggest determinant of what gets covered and what doesn't. So, when you're covering a conflict as a journalist, you have many things to weigh. One is safety. Where are you likely to be able to report in relative safety? Others are things like, military restrictions, areas where it's possible to go, where you're barred from going, etc. So access is always a massive factor. And we know that journalists in Gaza, there are very few in the north. Most of them have been pushed south. Even there, I woke up this morning in the UK to news of bombing of Khan Yunis around I think leaflets have been dropped telling people to now evacuate Khan Yunis in the south. So a constantly changing situation, and it's highly likely that we're only getting some parts of the story. we've called at RSF, we've submitted already a claim to the International Criminal Court asking for thorough investigations into the deaths of certain journalists. There will have to be, a long period of reckoning, of course, to look back to understand what happened. But without the journalists on the ground, and in a really, stark way, the death toll means that we have 37 fewer journalists able to report on Gaza. That's an enormous loss to journalism and to the reportage that comes out of it. And that number continues to rise. So yes, absolutely. There's a desperate need to get larger numbers of journalists in there in safety. At the moment, it's impossible because of the level of danger, but to increase access and make sure that we're getting a full picture of what's happening on the ground.
Now, you mentioned the question of access. How confident are you that now that the Israeli army controls Gaza City, the journalists covering that particular part of the war are able to report freely and fairly, including, and this is very important, contradicting or questioning claims made by the Israeli Defense Force? One of the claims that are being made at the moment, almost as we speak, is about tunnels that they say they found under the Shifa hospital, which have been described as the beating heart or the command center. At least one journalist I know, Ola Guerin of the BBC, very delicately suggested that what was shown didn't look like an awful lot. And if there was more that they had, it's surprising that the Israelis haven't made that more available, because what was available is just a handful of guns and a couple of hand grab bags. How possible is it for journalists there with the Israeli army around them to question and contradict what the army is saying?
It's a very, we have no confidence is the answer. I mean, if we look at precedent, if we go back even before this current wave of conflict, the IDF and the Israeli government don't have a history of promoting independent press. So last year, some of your viewers may remember in May 2022, a journalist called Shireen Abu Akleh was killed in Jenin while reporting for Al Jazeera. Subsequent to that, a number of investigations have very clearly pointed to the fact that the IDF was responsible for her death, but no justice has been served since then. No one's been held responsible for her death. I mentioned just now that at RSF, we have filed a complaint to the International Criminal Court linked to this conflict, but we also filed a complaint in 2018 when IDF snipers were firing at journalists. We also filed a complaint in 2021 when at least 20 offices of journalists were targeted. So there is a long history of the abuse of journalists and a repression of the press. Added to that, the general atmosphere, the atmosphere of disinformation that you mentioned. There is so much propaganda and disinformation on all sides flying around, because let's not forget as well that journalists in Gaza prior to the conflict came under enormous pressure from Hamas as well. Hamas is no promoter of free press and has also attempted to censor and repress independent reporting too. So on all sides, it's very difficult for journalists to navigate the political rhetoric, the huge swathes of disinformation that are out there. All these things are extremely challenging. And, for journalists all around the world reporting on this conflict from a distance as well, it becomes incredibly crucial, even more than usual, to verify everything, never to take anything at face value, and to really ask the questions to the best of their ability.
So far, we've been talking, Fiona O'Brien, about journalists in Gaza, whether it's in the north or in the south. What are conditions like for journalists in the West Bank, as well as journalists on the Lebanon side of the Israel-Lebanon border?
Yeah, so tensions have been really ratcheting up very alarmingly, especially in the last couple of weeks. We've seen a number of confrontations in the West Bank, also through Israel, between journalists, soldiers, police forces, settlers, civilian members of the population. There's a real potential for this to become worse as well as the conflict goes on. I think another interesting thing to point to that fuels these kinds of confrontations and enables them is some of the political rhetoric that has been going around. So earlier this month, I think it was on the 9th of November, so quite recently, an Israeli NGO posted some information on their platform insinuating, with no evidence, with no substantiation at all, that members of the international press, so reporters for CNN, New York Times, Reuters, and Associated Press, had somehow known about the Hamas attacks on 7th of October before they happened, were in some way complicit, that it was all a bit suspicious. So utterly unsubstantiated and very dangerous, questions to put out there. Bad enough in itself, but what then happened is extremely worrying, is that was then picked up by various politicians, including Benjamin Netanyahu's office himself, various members of the Likud party, amplified on social media to such an extent that we had the office of Netanyahu accusing journalists of being accomplices of crimes against humanity, to such an extent that we had Danny Danon, a former Israeli diplomat and member of the Likud party, calling for the elimination of journalists, saying that they must be hunted down like terrorists. So this kind of political rhetoric is unbelievably incendiary and dangerous, and kind of ratchets up that tension that makes journalists a target. And we are extremely concerned about that kind of language, which will only make a very, very bad situation even worse.
Let me ask you, Fiona O'Brien, about the coverage by the major television networks, and I'll stick to the two that are most widely watched in my country, India. Both the BBC and Al Jazeera have been accused of tilting in favor of the Palestinian side, although obviously for different reasons. Can you comment on that criticism?
It's a really valid question, and there are accusations flying around in all directions accusing various medias of bias. I don't want to comment on any individual platform, but what I would say is that there is so much misinformation, propaganda, division, politicizing of everything going on. I think what everybody needs to do, and this is not just for journalists to do, but for society as a whole, is to put the human story at the center of what's happening. Remember that there are victims on all sides of this conflict, that we don't need to be either for one side or for another, that we can, stand up for humanity, and really take a step back and ratchet down that political rhetoric, that accusatory rhetoric. For the most part, the journalists around the world are doing their best in a very difficult situation to report very fast-moving news with very limited access. Again, if journalists had better access to the things that were happening, if they were able to report in safety, they would be able to do so in a much more complete and thorough way. So opening up access, making sure that journalists have, are safe and able to continue their jobs is essential here.
Let me put to you a criticism that I've heard from Israelis. They say that television channels like the BBC, Al Jazeera, perhaps more than any other, have been effective in switching the world's sympathy, which was initially with Israel, now to the Palestinians. And they believe this is a reflection not of what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, but a reflection of the biased coverage by which way the problem that the Palestinians face has been projected to the world. Is there any possible truth to that criticism?
I mean, I don't think so. News, as the word suggests, deals with what's happening on a day-to-day basis. Rolling news covers, we have 24/7 news channels now which are covering events as they develop. And right now, the story and the urgency is in Gaza. So it's absolutely right that news organizations around the world should be telling us what's happening in Gaza, that should be speaking the truth. 11,500 civilians have been killed in Gaza. We've been talking about journalists today, and for that reason, that journalists have an extraordinarily important role to play in reporting on war. But of course, again, that number beside the overall death toll is, a speck in the ocean. The number of civilians being killed, bombarded, removed from their homes, denied access to water, sanitation is the story right now. I don't see any reason why telling the story of what's happening in Gaza now removes any sympathy for the victims of the horrendous attacks in Israel, which kickstarted this particular phase of the conflict, which has gone on for decades. I saw today, looking at the news as I woke up, the top headline in the UK today is about a hostage who's very sadly been found killed. So today's story will be very much the focus again on the hostages, because that's where the news cycle is at right now. So I don't think we should look for conspiracies in news coverage. I think it's very dangerous to do so at such a divisive time.
My last question. Significant voices in the West have questioned the Gaza death toll, primarily because it used to be put out by the Hamas Ministry of Health, based, by the way, in Ramallah, not in Gaza. For the last week or so, they haven't been able to update the death toll because they simply don't have that information any longer. But nonetheless, President Biden has questioned it. The Israelis have done so strenuously. On the other hand, the World Health Organization, UNRWA, and Save the Children, just to name those three, have said the figures put out by the Hamas Ministry of Health are reliable and accurate. Does Reporters Sans Frontières have a stand on this issue?
We don't take a particular stand in the sense that, our remit is journalism and what's happening to journalists. But what I would say is we would trust the experts. We would trust, UN agencies who know what they're doing and have long experience in calculating these kinds of horrendous tolls. I also think that, to reiterate really the central message from me today is that what we need to be doing is halting the conflict in order to, stop the death toll rising and rising and rising. The rest of the questions, what exactly has happened over the past month, where numbers are at, can wait. What cannot wait is the civilians in Gaza today who are yet again facing death, insecurity, loss of loved ones.
Fiona O'Brien, thank you very much for the time you've given me. And in particular, thank you for opening our eyes to an aspect of this crisis that hasn't got the attention it deserves. I hope we've made one small stab at attempting to rectify that. Thank you very much indeed.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on The Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.